morning. On October 2nd, 2013, Brianna Anderson, a 22-year-old mother from Tampa, was home with her boyfriend, Jamar Silas, when he shot her once in the head, killing her in front of their 3-year-old son, Tyler. Ms. Anderson was 8 months pregnant. Mr. Silas was a convicted felon. He should have never had a gun. This situation is far too common. Every day in America, a woman is killed by a domestic partner using a gun. Nationally, more domestic violence homicides occur using firearms than all other methods combined. The mere presence of a firearm in an abusive relationship intensifies victims' fears and escalates violent incidents, increasing the risk of homicide by more than 500%. Florida is not exempt from this problem. Nearly 200 Floridians die every year in domestic violence-related incidents. Here at home in our community, we face the same challenges. From 2012 to 2016, Hillsborough County suffered 61 domestic violence homicides. There's a connection between domestic violence and mass shootings. The majority of mass shootings are related to domestic or family violence. More than a third of mass shootings nationally involved a perpetrator who is legally prohibited from owning a firearm. The recent church shooting in Sutherland Springs, Texas being one example. Domestic violence is a serious problem, and guns in the hands of domestic abusers are a deadly combination. The time has arrived to take serious action about domestic violence and guns. We can do more. We need to do more. And here in Hillsborough, we will do more. Today I'm announcing a new initiative aimed at disarming domestic abusers. We will aggressively enforce existing gun laws to protect victims of abuse. State and federal law prohibit the possession of a firearm by anyone convicted of domestic violence. Florida law also prohibits a person who is subject to a domestic violence-related injunction from possessing a gun. Unfortunately, inconsistent enforcement of these laws has allowed abusers access to firearms. Too often, intimidation, injury, and even death are the tragic consequences. As state attorney, I refuse to stand by while our mothers and daughters, sisters and friends are being assaulted, threatened, and killed by domestic abusers who have forfeited their right to own a gun. I'm committed to aggressively enforcing laws that are already on the books to keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers. This policy has two goals: to remove guns from domestic abusers and to make sure that they cannot acquire new guns. As a condition of pretrial release, as part of probation, plea agreement, or entry into a diversion program, we will seek to relinquish guns from any defendant charged with domestic violence who is legally prohibited from owning a gun. Additionally, we will seek to relinquish from any defendant without a criminal history, but who's been charged with domestic violence based upon a probable cause determination, to relinquish any guns where necessary to protect the victim from further harm. The success of this initiative starts with our law enforcement partners. For the past several months, I've been working closely with Sheriff G and Sheriff Chronister, Chief Dugan, Chief Albano at Temple Terrace, Chief Duncan in Plant City. I thank them for their input and the support of this initiative. By taking and keeping guns away from abusers, we will reduce domestic violence. We will help victims overcome the overwhelming, paralyzing fear that comes from having an armed, abusive partner. And we will hopefully save lives. But aggressively enforcing existing laws will do even more than that. We will make victims feel safe enough to come forward. We will simplify the prosecution of domestic abusers by imposing additional charges or conditions, which become pivotal when victims become reluctant to testify. We will take illegal guns off the street, guns that are often sold illegally or used to commit other crimes. And we will protect law enforcement by alerting officers to the presence of a gun when responding to a domestic incident. On September 2nd, 2011, Auburndale police officer Stacy Booth responded to a 911 call from an 8-year-old about her parents fighting. When Officer Booth arrived at the house, the mother and the 8-year-old were gone, but the father, Michael Lester, ambushed Officer Booth, firing some 20 rounds through the front door with his assault rifle, critically wounding her. Mr. Lester had a lengthy criminal record, including a conviction for domestic violence. He should have never had a gun. For Breanna Anderson, for Officer Booth, and for all the victims who have been threatened, hurt, or killed by a domestic partner with a gun, let me be clear. We hear you, we support you, and we are committed to disarming domestic abusers. At this time, I'd like to identify several of our community partners who have joined us today for this announcement. This impressive group of leaders represents agencies that not only support victims at their most difficult times, but who see the damage that domestic violence causes to victims, to children, and to our entire community. From the Crisis Center of Tampa Bay, President and CEO Claire Reynolds, who is joined by Ken Gibson, Kathleen Kemke, and Bernadette Fritsch. From the Spring of Tampa Bay, President and CEO Mindy Murphy. From Moms Demand Action Against Gun Violence, Tampa Group Leader Wendy Malloy. From the Hillsborough County League of Women Voters, Nancy Granda and Sandra Swerka. Thank you all for your support of this initiative and for everything you do for our community. It's now my privilege to introduce this Spring's Mindy Murphy, followed by the Crisis Center's Claire Reynolds to share their thoughts.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to try and get through this without coughing. I apologize in advance, I have a cold. As the only state-certified domestic violence center serving Hillsborough County, the Spring of Tampa Bay provides comprehensive services to enhance the safety of survivors of domestic violence and their children. We do that through an array of programs. Our 128-bed emergency shelter, our 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week, 365 days a year crisis hotline for survivors of domestic violence, our Peace Village 12-unit apartment complex that offers a 1-year stay for survivors trying to work on economic independence, 2 outreach services centers, one located in Tampa, another in Plant City, that are actually public locations for survivors to walk in off the street, and they can reasonably expect to be seen that day or be given an appointment within the next 2 days to get the services they need to be safe. And 3 attorneys, soon to be 4, whose sole responsibility is to provide legal assistance and representation to victims for injunctions for protection, regardless of income, since we know abusers also use economic violence as a way to control. We also have staff embedded with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office to work with officers on high-risk cases and to offer services to those victims. We have other program staff embedded with the child welfare system for safety and support to moms who may have a child in the system because of the abuser's behavior. And we have ancillary services like our PET program, again, all designed to keep survivors and children safe. But we can't do this without strong partnerships in the community, because we're only one half of the equation. We're the half of the equation that provides direct assistance to victims and survivors. We're the half of the equation that provides assistance to the children of these survivors, including an on-site school in partnership with Hillsborough County Public Schools. We're the half of the equation that does prevention programming in the schools and with community groups to try and stop domestic violence from ever occurring. But we need a strong partnership with law enforcement and our legal system to ensure that the other half of the equation, the half that holds abusers in our community accountable for the choices they make, we need that part of the equation to do their job with as much passion, commitment, and dedication as the service side, helping survivors, does each and every day. And that's why the Spring of Tampa Bay is delighted that State Attorney Warren and his office have stepped up to say we have got to do more to hold domestic abusers accountable and to keep women and children in our community safe. We think that Disarming Domestic Abusers initiative that State Attorney Warren is announcing today is going to result in a safer community, safer for the victims and survivors, safer for their children and families, but safer for all of us. Because what we know is domestic violence affects all of us. According to Everytown for Gun Safety, 54% of the 156 mass shootings from 2009 to 2016 in our community, in our state and country, were rooted in domestic or family violence. Getting guns out of the hands of these domestic abusers will keep victims and their children safer, and will also keep all of us safer. I would like to say thank you to State Attorney Warren and his office for recognizing how dangerous abusers are and for taking additional steps to hold them accountable. I'd like to say thank you to law enforcement for working with State Attorney Warren on this initiative. I'd like to say thank you to the Chief Judge and our court personnel who've agreed to host next month a Circuit 13 Domestic Violence Summit to discuss best practices in addressing domestic violence within the criminal justice system. Again, we cannot do this work without a strong team in our community, and the Spring can't do this work without other partners like those in the room, like the Crisis Center, Are You Safe? And we can't do this work without the voices of courageous survivors in our community who speak up every day to share their stories in hopes that no one else will experience what they experienced. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. Thank you, State Attorney Warren, for the work you do. And thank you to everyone in the community for stepping up and saying, enough is enough. Domestic violence in our community has got to end. Thank you. Clara.
On behalf of the Crisis Center of Tampa Bay, but also survivors of domestic assault and sexual abuse, we want to thank State Attorney Warren for his efforts in this action. We've been communicating with survivors for years through our 211 information referral line, as well as through our trauma counseling program, as well as our sexual assault department. As the community certified rape crisis center, we see these victims every day who are also victims of sexual assault as well as domestic violence. They tell us what it is like to be threatened with guns and how those guns keep them silent and keep them hidden and keep them in the background. So we are so excited today to be a part of this, solution. And again, we want to thank everybody that has been a part of this. And for anybody out there today who is struggling with domestic violence or sexual assault because of domestic violence, we ask that you reach out to us. 211 is the community's information referral line. It's the place where you can find help, hope, and healing in a time of crisis, confidentially, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Because when you call, you will be believed and you will be supported. So thank you all again so much for all that you do to support this, and thank you so much as well.
Well, thank you, Mindy and Clara, for your strong words of support and for fighting so hard on this issue every day. We know how much you do to support victims, and we value your partnership with this office tremendously. Every time we allow a domestic abuser access to a firearm, we put that person's partner, our law enforcement, and the entire community in danger. We don't need to wait for Tallahassee or Washington to act, because we have laws on the books already that protect victims of abuse. It's about time we started aggressively and consistently enforcing those laws, and that's exactly what we're going to do. This is about freeing victims from the fear, coercion, and intimidation that comes from having an armed, abusive partner. This is about preventing violence and saving lives. This is about building a safer, stronger community. Thank you again for being here today. I have a few minutes to answer any questions.
What do you make of the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act that essentially subjects Florida to weaker gun laws in other states, and the fact that maybe other states have weaker domestic violence definitions than we do, and it would allow them to come to Florida and carry their guns here? How does this fit into that?
Florida has passed laws about when you can concealed carry and what the requirements are that are intelligent checks on that system. The Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act removes those laws and subjects Florida to the lowest common denominator of every state law in the country. That is the lowest common denominator of any state. I was up in Washington a few weeks ago lobbying specifically against that legislation. I was disappointed to see that it passed the House, but hopefully it won't pass the Senate.
So having said that, do you not need Washington and the state's help to do what you're trying to do here?
There are always room for legislative improvements, but this is about aggressively and consistently enforcing laws that are already on the books. That's how we can protect victims. That's how we can protect law-abiding members of our community. That's how we can protect law enforcement officers.
You talked about how you've reached out to Sheriff Chronister and the police chiefs. What will they be doing differently than what they're currently doing?
So, law enforcement responders are the first responders to a scene. They provide, on that first contact of a domestic violence incident, the critical window of opportunity to identify whether someone has a gun and potentially to save lives. They will be determining the access of an abuser to a firearm, conveying that information to this office so we can consistently, aggressively, and systematically use the leverage of the criminal justice system to disarm people who should not have guns in the first place.
As a domestic, is there a definition of domestic violence versus domestic abuse?
There's no distinction. Domestic violence, domestic abuse is the same. We're talking about laws that prohibit convicted felons, people who are convicted of a domestic violence misdemeanor, or people who are subject to a domestic violence related injunction under state law. Those groups of people are prohibited from owning guns, and we're going to use the leverage of the prosecutorial process to make sure that they don't have guns.
So as an African-American male, as a concealed weapons owner, and as an advocate of stricter gun laws, how can we mitigate or minimize African-American males from having their rights taken on a mere spat in the residence?
Well, this is about protecting law-abiding citizens, protecting victims, protecting law enforcement from people who should not have access to guns. That's what it's about.
So the policeman is the first one to make the determination that this individual does not have the right to own a gun.
No, law enforcement will make the initial inquiry about, in a domestic violence incident, somebody's access to a firearm. State Attorney's Office will then conduct background checks, check for any pending domestic violence injunctions, so that when the legal process begins, we can use the legal process to force the relinquishment of that firearm.
What is law enforcement's responsibility to inspect and then detain firearms after an injunction or order by a judge or whatever? What is law enforcement's responsibility?
Law enforcement currently does that, so they work now in a variety of cases when guns are relinquished as part of the process, as part of the legal process, to safely store, keep, dispose of, or even return those firearms to a person at the appropriate time. They'll continue doing that. This is just on a broader basis.
Do they have to inspect? Do they have to go to people's residences to make sure there's gun-free in those residences?
It will involve law enforcement determining, to the best of their ability, by looking at criminal history, asking witnesses, asking victims to determine the abuser's access to a firearm, and then we'll use the legal process to end up having the defendant relinquish the firearm.
Mr. Warren, if I could, on another case, the shark dragging case, you have made some charges, made arrests in that case. Why wasn't everybody on that boat where that shark was dragged arrested?
This morning, we'd really like to focus on the initiative of disarming domestic abusers. This is why we've brought in our community partners. This is an important issue for our community today.
I understand, but the other cases garnered national attention, and I got a couple of questions about that, about why it took so long, and why wasn't everybody on the boat charged?
Sure, and at the appropriate time, I'd be happy to answer those questions, but today we're talking about disarming domestic abusers.
Can you elaborate on other ways that this initiative is different than what's happening now?
The biggest problem right now is the lack of consistent, aggressive enforcement of laws on the books. This is about saving lives. A woman a day is killed in this country by a domestic abuser with a gun. More than half of those cases involve the perpetrator having been involved with the criminal justice system for domestic violence beforehand. We have pending cases in this office where a defendant's been charged with murder of a domestic partner who had prior run-ins with the legal system related to domestic violence. Had we consistently and aggressively disarmed those abusers, we may have saved lives. It's as simple as that.
Is there a time when an abuser's rights can be restored to get the firearm?
If, for example, someone's been charged with a crime who has no prior criminal history or injunction that would prohibit them from owning a gun, after the conclusion of a case, if they've been acquitted and the judge determines it's appropriate to return a firearm at that point, then absolutely yes.
So no special program that they could go through, any special training? That's not the policy, it's just the legal system will determine whether or not they.
The special training they have to go through is consistent with Florida's right to concealed carry and all other federal and state laws to possess a firearm.
So what about domestic violence training?
Domestic violence training would be part of sanctions imposed on a person going through the domestic violence process when charged with a DV crime. Again, our focus here today is not on changing how we've been prosecuting DV cases, but rather on making sure that we are aggressively enforcing laws to disarm domestic abusers.
We're going to go ahead and cut off the questions.
Thank you very much for being here. Have a good morning, everyone.
Thank you.